I slipped into our Kansas City home's library just past midnight, the bar's cheap gin still humming in my blood, the downtown's neon poles fading behind me, when I spotted my stepdad Marcus, a 58-year-old ex-chess champion now coaching at a school, hunched over a laptop, his face caught in the soft glow of an old tournament video, all quiet focus and weathered charm that I'd been itching to unravel for weeks. Mom, Susan, was asleep upstairs, her landscape design binders left open on the dining table, and I knew her sharp ears could catch any misstep, her habit of quizzing my late nights, like when she'd pinned me about a missed call, making me step light. But I wanted Marcus's attention, had wanted it for a while, and the buzz made it easy to make my move. I eased off my jacket, saying his screen looked too dull for a Friday, my voice soft, teasing, meant to pull his eyes, not wake her, hoping he'd catch the bait I was tossing. Marcus glanced up, his glasses low, a faint crease in his brow, saying I'd chosen a late hour to crash his quiet, his tone dry, almost professorial, but with a glint, like he'd noticed my sway and wasn't entirely put off. I leaned against a bookshelf, saying he'd look better out of that sweater, my fingers brushing the edge of a worn novel, a slow gesture to draw his gaze, knowing Susan's bedroom was close enough to hear a laugh, her last email about a client deal still unanswered on my phone. I wasn't going for a bold play, not yet, just a nudge, a way to plant a seed I'd been tending, and I said his students probably fell asleep in class, my words light, probing, because I needed to see if he'd counter, not just sit there as her steady anchor. He closed the laptop halfway, saying sleep wasn't his problem, and stood, his shirt slightly untucked, stepping toward the shelf, his hand resting on a book near mine, not touching, but close enough to send a ripple I'd angled for, his voice low, asking what I was after, like he'd seen my opening and wasn't quite folding. I tilted my head, saying I'd bet he had more fire than he showed, my scarf slipping an inch, a deliberate slip to keep his focus, and he said fire like mine was a risk he'd rather study, his tone a mix of caution and dry wit, his fingers shifting the book, brushing the air by my wrist, not grabbing, but enough to spark the heat I'd wanted, his paws heavy, like he was deciding whether to step back or lean in, the library's stillness wrapping us like a held note, Susan's floorboards silent but her presence looming, like she'd sense if I spoke too loud. I wanted to press, see how far he'd bend, but I knew the game needed time, so I pulled the novel out, flipping it open, saying I'd steal his late nights one day, my voice a soft challenge, a promise I meant, and he gave a half-smile, saying nights like mine were trouble, his hand nudging a pen on the desk, a counter that landed, because I'd wanted it, wanted him to play, even if Susan's shadow was too near. Her bedroom door creaked upstairs, her voice calling my name, groggy, asking who was stirring, like she'd caught a wrong sound in the dark, and I stepped back, sliding the book onto the shelf, saying I'd grabbed a read, my voice quick, casual, while Marcus sat, reopening his laptop, saying he'd been reviewing, his tone even, like he hadn't just matched my move, his glance brief, like he knew I'd felt it. I shouted I'd crash soon, heading for the stairs, Susan at the landing, her eyes narrowing at my loose scarf, asking why I was up so late, her gaze flicking to the library's light, like she'd caught a shift in the air, detail she'd tuck away, and I said the bar ran long, shrugging, my steps fast, not looking at him, but feeling his eyes, knowing he'd stayed quiet, letting me carry it, the library's dim glow thick with the opening I'd made. She didn't press, muttering about her morning, but her pause lingered, and I shut my door, the gin's haze fading, Marcus's spark smoldering, planning my next move, because her eyes saw too much, and I wasn't letting this match slip, not when I'd just made my play. For days after I'd stirred that flicker in the library, I was itching to dodge Mom's, Susan's, endless landscape design charts sprawled across our Kansas City dining room, her voice a steady hum on a client call about rooftop gardens. When I saw a chance to nudge my game with Marcus further, heading to his chess school downtown to drop off a flyer for her charity gala, knowing he'd be there setting up for a weekend workshop. I'd been replaying his quiet counter in the library, the way his fingers had brushed the air near mine, and I wanted to turn up the heat, keep him off balance, because I'd cast the first move and wasn't about to let it stall. Susan's sharp eye for my late-night slips, like when she'd questioned my loose scarf, had me stepping carefully, but the thrill of teasing Marcus was too sharp to pass up, so I slipped on a jacket, leaving the top button undone, and headed out, her last text about a client pitch unanswered on my phone. The chess school was a cozy loft above a coffee shop, smelling of roasted beans and old wood, with tables scattered like islands, each holding a board, and Marcus stood by a chalkboard, jotting notes, his glasses low, his sweater swapped for a crisp shirt that made him look less like a coach and more like the champion I'd been craving to unsettle since I'd leaned into him that night. I tossed the flyer onto his table, saying his workshop looked too stiff for a guy who'd owned tournaments, my voice bright, edged with a grin, meant to hook his focus, and he glanced up, saying I'd wandered into his turf uninvited, his tone dry, almost biting, but with a twitch at his mouth, like he'd caught my play and wasn't entirely shutting it down. I slid into a chair, saying Susan's gala needed his polish to draw a crowd, my fingers tapping the flyer, a slow rhythm to pull his eyes, knowing Susan was tied up with clients, but her call could buzz any second, her shadow close enough to make my nerves hum, not from worry, but from the rush of dancing near the edge. I propped my elbow on the table, saying he'd probably lost his knack for charming anyone but students, my jacket slipping open a fraction, a deliberate tilt to keep his gaze, and he set his chalk down, saying charm like mine was a harder board to play. His words slow, laced with a sardonic curl, like he'd seen my move and raised it, his hand shifting a stack of notes, brushing the air near my fingers, not touching, but close enough to spark the heat I'd been chasing, his paws heavy, like he was sizing up whether to retreat or push. I leaned forward, saying boards like me needed a bold hand, my voice a soft challenge, because I wasn't here for a stalemate, just to shift the pieces, keep him in my game. Susan's last question about my library detour still nagging, her eyes too keen to miss a misstep. He said bold hands risked losing pieces, and stepped to a board, flipping a pawn, saying he'd show me a move if I stayed, his tone half teasing, half serious, like he'd matched my play, and I stood, saying I'd watch if he made it quick, my fingers trailing the table's edge. A move to keep him locked, the loft's hum of distant espresso machines wrapping us tight, like we'd carved a pocket Susan couldn't pierce, but her presence loomed, her email about a vendor deal a whisper in my head. I wanted to press, see how far he'd bend, but I knew the game needed patience, so I slid the flyer closer, saying he'd better show up to regala, or I'd make his nights harder, my voice a mix of jest and promise, and he gave a low chuckle, saying hard nights weren't his worry, his hand nudging a notebook, a counter that landed, because I'd wanted it, wanted him to bite, even if Susan's shadow was too near. Her car rolled into the drive, earlier than planned, her voice calling my name from the porch, crisp, asking why I wasn't home, like she'd sensed a wrong beat, and I stepped back, grabbing my bag, saying I'd dropped the flyer, my voice quick, steady, while Marcus sat, flipping open his notes, saying he'd been planning, his tone calm, like he hadn't just played my move, his glance brief, like he knew I'd felt it. I shouted I'd be out, heading for the door, Susan waiting, her eyes catching my undone jacket, asking why I'd gone there, her gaze flicking to the loft's window, like she'd caught a shift in my stride, detail she'd stow, and I said I'd helped with her gala, shrugging, my steps fast, not looking at him, but feeling his eyes, knowing he'd stayed silent, letting me carry it, the loft's warm light thick with the nudge I'd made. She didn't dig, muttering about her client, but her paws stuck, and I headed home, the bar's buzz gone, Marcus's spark smoldering, planning my next play, because her eyes saw too much, and I wasn't letting this slip, not when I'd just moved my piece. A week after I'd stirred that heat in Marcus's chess school loft, I was restless in our Kansas City house, Susan's landscape design binders and client emails about urban parks piling up like a cage, when I slipped onto the back balcony one humid evening, craving fresh air and a chance to push my game further, knowing Marcus would be there fixing a flickering lantern, a chore Susan had nagged him about. I'd been savoring the way his dry wit had met my jabs in that loft, his hand brushing the air near mine, and I wanted to tip the scales, see if I could draw him out, because I'd been steering this dance and wasn't about to let it stall. Susan's knack for catching my sly moves, like when she'd eyed my undone jacket, had me treading lightly, but the rush of teasing Marcus was too potent to resist, so I tugged my scarf loose, letting it drape, and stepped out, Susan's voice drifting from downstairs, her call with a client winding down, a reminder her sharp ears could catch any misstep. The balcony overlooked our small yard, the city's skyline a faint glow through the haze, and Marcus stood by the railing, fiddling with the lantern's wiring, his shirt sleeves rolled, his glasses tucked in his pocket, looking less like a coach and more like the chess master I'd been craving to unsettle since I'd baited him in the library. I leaned against the railing, saying his fix-it skills looked shaky for a guy who'd outplayed champs, my voice light, laced with a grin meant to hook his focus, and he glanced over, saying I'd picked a bad night to critique his work, his tone sharp, sardonic, but with a glint in his eyes, like he'd caught my drift and wasn't dodging it. I shifted closer, saying Susan's gala would need more than his lantern tricks to impress, my fingers brushing the railing's edge, a slow move to pull his gaze, knowing Susan was just below, her call ending soon. Her last text about a vendor deal still unread on my phone, the risk making my nerves hum, not from fear, but from the thrill of playing so near the line. I tilted my chin, saying he'd probably forgotten how to light up anything but a board, my scarf slipping a fraction, a deliberate nudge to keep his eyes, and he set the screwdriver down, saying lights like mine were harder to handle, his words slow, layered with a cautious edge, like he'd seen my play and was weighing his next move, his hand resting on the lantern, shifting it slightly, brushing the air near my arm, not touching, but close enough to send a jolt I'd angled for, his paws heavy. Like he was wrestling with something he couldn't name, the balcony's quiet broken only by the distant hum of cicadas, Susan's voice now silent, her presence looming like a shadow I could feel. I wanted to push, see how far he'd go, so I leaned closer, saying handling me would take more than tricks, my voice a soft dare, because I wasn't here for a draw, just to move the pieces, keep him on my board. Susan's last question about my loft visit still fresh, her eyes too keen to miss a wrong step. He stepped back, adjusting the lantern, then stopped, his voice lower, saying he'd been trying to keep this straight, but I was making it hard, that he felt something he shouldn't, something real, his words raw, not polished, like he'd laid his pieces bare, and I froze, my fingers tightening on the railing, because I'd wanted this, pushed for it, but hearing it hit different, a spark I'd stoked now flaring, guilt creeping in, sharp, because I'd meant to control, not feel, Susan's binders. Downstairs a reminder of what I was risking. I said he'd better be sure, my voice softer, almost a question, because I felt it too, and it scared me, even as it thrilled, and I stepped closer, saying sure was my kind of move, my hand brushing the lantern's base, a calculated shift to keep him locked, but real enough to mean it, the night's haze wrapping us tight, like we'd stepped into a space no one else could touch. Susan's voice cut through, calling my name from the kitchen, clipped, asking why I was out there, like she'd caught a wrong pause in the house, and I pulled back, saying I'd needed air, my voice too quick, adjusting my scarf to look casual, while Marcus knelt, tightening a screw, saying he'd been fixing, his tone even, like he hadn't just bared himself, his glance fleeting, like he knew I'd felt it. I shouted I'd be down, heading for the door, Susan waiting, her eyes catching my flushed cheeks, asking what took so long, her gaze flicking to the balcony's light, like she'd caught a shift in my tone, detail she'd hold, and I said I'd helped with the lantern, shrugging, my steps fast, not looking at him, but feeling his eyes, knowing he'd stayed silent, letting me carry it, the balcony's warm air thick with what I'd drawn out. She didn't press, muttering about her client, but her pause stuck, and I headed upstairs, the bar's buzz gone, Marcus's confession burning, planning my next play, because her eyes saw too much, and I wasn't letting this slip, not when I'd just moved closer to check. A month after Marcus's balcony confession set my pulse racing, I tagged along to a Kansas City warehouse to sort chess promo gear, Susan's garden design emails flooding our house, her voice a hum about tree placements. I knew Marcus would be there, and I wanted to push our game, his raw words still burning. Susan's sharp eye, like when she'd caught my balcony flush, kept me cautious, but the thrill of baiting Marcus was too strong, so I wore a loose scarf, ready to play, her text about a client unanswered. The warehouse smelled of dust and cardboard, boxes stacked high, and Marcus stood sorting flyers, his shirt creased, looking less like a coach and more like the champ I'd been unraveling. I said his promo looked dull, my voice sly, aiming to hook him, and he shot back I'd wandered into his work uninvited, his tone dry, sardonic, eyes glinting. I grabbed a box, saying Susan's gala needed his spark, my scarf slipping, and nudged to draw him. He set a flyer down, saying sparks like mine were trouble, his hand brushing a box near mine, not touching, sparking heat I'd chased. Susan's call echoed below, asking where I was, sharp. I said it helped Marcus, a voice quick, guilt hitting as I stepped back, her eyes catching my scarf, details she'd hold, the warehouse's hum thick with what I'd stoked. 1 week after I pushed Marcus's limits in that dusty Kansas City warehouse, I lured him to a foggy Missouri riverfront for a chess school promo. Susan's garden design emails cluttering our house, her voice droning about plaza layouts. His balcony confession still burned, and I wanted to raise the stakes, my gin-soaked buzz from a bar fueling my nerve. Susan's sharp eye, like when she'd caught my scarf, kept me wary, but the thrill of cornering Marcus was too potent, so I wore a loose jacket, ready to play, her text about a client ignored. The riverfront's planks creaked under dim lights, food truck neon hazy in the fog, and Marcus stood by a table with a chessboard, sleeves rolled, less coach, more champion I'd craved to unravel. I said his promo needed my heat, voice sly, hooking him, and he quipped I'd crashed his plan, tone sardonic, eyes glinting. I sat, shoving a pawn, saying he'd lose fast, jacket slipping, a taunt to draw him. He moved a knight, saying I'd pushed too far, his hand brushing the board near mine, sparking heat I'd chased. I leaned in, whispering I'd want his mate, fingers nudging his bold, deliberate. Susan's call rang, sharp, asking where I was. I said it helped Marcus, his voice quick, guilt surging as I stood, her eyes catching my flush, details she'd hold, the fog thick with what I'd ignited. 1 week after our drunken chess match on that foggy Kansas City riverfront left my blood electric, I slipped into our home study on a rainy Thursday night, Susan's landscape design binders cluttering every corner. Her voice a faint echo from a client meeting she'd rushed to, a rare window to push my game with Marcus to its limit. His balcony confession and riverfront countermoves still burned, and I wanted to seal this dance, not with a reckless lunge, but with a move that'd leave him pinned. Susan's sharp eye, like when she'd caught my flushed cheeks, kept me cautious, but the thrill of cornering Marcus was too fierce, so I wore a loose blouse, collar open, and stepped in, finding him at the desk, sorting chess promo notes, his shirt creased, glasses low, less coach, more the champion I'd been unraveling since that library night. I leaned against the desk, saying his notes looked duller than his old matches, my voice sharp, teasing, meant to hook, and he glanced up, saying I'd crashed his work again, his tone dry, sardonic, but his eyes held a glint, like he'd been waiting. I slid a pen across, saying Susan's gala needed his edge, my blouse slipping a fraction, a deliberate tilt to pull his gaze, knowing Susan could return any moment, her last text about a delayed vendor unanswered, the risk making my nerves sing. He set the pen down, saying edges like mine cut too deep, his words slow, layered with caution, his hand shifting a notebook, brushing the air near my fingers, not touching, but sparking heat I'd chased, his paws heavy, like he was teetering on a line we'd both drawn, the study's quiet hum of rain outside wrapping us tight, Susan's binders a stark reminder of what I'd staked. I stood, saying deep cuts were my specialty, my voice a soft dare, and stepped closer, saying he'd been dodging me since the riverfront, my fingers trailing the desk's edge, a move to keep him locked, guilt sharp now, because I'd pushed too far, felt too much, Susan's photo on the shelf hitting like a warning. He rose, saying he wasn't dodging, but I'd made it impossible to stay clear, his voice raw, not polished, like he'd bared his last defense, and I froze, my hand on a binder, because I'd wanted this, but the weight of it, her trust, our home, crushed in, guilt louder than the rain. I said impossible was my move, but my voice cracked, because I felt it too, and it scared me, the study's shadows closing in, like we'd built a trap we couldn't escape. Susan's car crunched the gravel, home early, her voice calling my name, furious, like she'd sensed a wrong note, and I stepped back, saying I'd been helping, voice shaky, while Marcus grabbed his notes, saying he'd been working, his tone flat, his glance fleeting, like he knew we'd crossed too far. Susan stormed in, eyes blazing, screaming what I'd done, her voice shredding, saying she'd seen my texts, his late hours, my dodges, accusing Marcus of failing her again, her words slicing at secrets I didn't know, throwing a binder at the wall, yelling I'd broken her trust, broken us, and I stood, frozen, as Marcus's silence roared, the study's light spilling out, leaving me to face the wreck I'd made.